Okay, with that prompting, I think we are ready to start. A very warm welcome today, Tuesday, the 23rd of May, 2023, a day we hope we will be able to remember and add many more days to that in terms of the expert dialogue series that the Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism has embarked on. The idea with this experts dialogue series is for us to engage with different experts from various spaces in the migration governance and diaspora space, but also for us to open up various sectors and spaces in development cooperation, spaces in health, to find out how migration governance intersects with private sector, how it intersects with climate change, and how it intersects with many other topics that are of relevance and importance today, whether these topics are being talked about at the grassroots level, in research, in spaces where civil society gather to understand a bit more what they can do in terms of advocacy, or indeed in national, regional, and global discourse. And so the idea with the expert diaspora series is that we will invite experts, particularly scholars and practitioners, to join us in this virtual room. So everything will be done virtually, and engage with us, share with us their perspectives in terms of the topic that we will have at hand. And today, I'm really delighted that we are opening, or rather launching, the expert diaspora, the experts dialogue series. It's such a tongue twister when I think about it. And our focus is on Sudan, and particularly looking at the crisis in Sudan and the people on the move. And why is this important to us, even in the context of having conversations with experts? We understand that there may be a lot of views out there, and there may be a lot of mainstream media that's shared. There's a lot that goes out on social media. But what we would like to do is to give an opportunity when we have an emerging issue in the migration governance space to the various experts that we've engaged with here at GRFDT, those who are part of GRFDT, the various partners that we engage with in the scholarly world, as well as in the space of migration governance discourse. And so today we're joined by Dr. Iman Ahmed, who is a global health and international migration expert and has worked with over 20 years of practice in the field of humanitarian assistance. She's worked in international development, global health, large-scale emergency management, as well as the humanitarian development and peace nexus. She holds a medical doctorate from the University of Khartoum in Sudan, a Master of Arts in Global Affairs and Public Policy from the American University in Cairo, and there she focused on migration and refugee studies. She holds a Master of...
The voice is not audible, right?
Oh, sorry about that. I think that is my cue to make sure that I'm able to repeat Dr. Iman Ahmed's profile, who is joining us today as our expert for today. So today we are in conversation with Dr. Iman Ahmed, who is a global health and migration expert. She is also wearing a new hat these days as a Global Research Forum on Diaspora and Transnationalism non-resident fellow. And at the same time, she has over 20 years of practice in the field of humanitarian assistance, international development, global health, large-scale emergency management, as well as working on the humanitarian development peace nexus. She holds a medical doctorate from the University of Khartoum in Sudan, a Master of Art in Global Affairs and Public Policy from the American University in Cairo. She has a Master of Public Health from the University College Cork in Ireland, and has also held various positions and consulted with the United Nations, with the UNHCR, WHO, as well as worked as a researcher at the University of Toronto and the American University in Cairo. She has a number of published articles in medical journals and a book title that focused on Sudan, particularly looking at a case of population displacement and impoverishment in northern part of Sudan. And another hat that's important that she wears is working around coordination. So this is on diaspora engagement with the Sudan Union's Doctors Union. We'll hear more about what her work has meant and what brings us to ask Dr. Iman today to share with us, as we have this focus today on looking at the movement of people following the crisis in Sudan. Dr. Iman, you are welcome and really delighted to have you. And just again to welcome all those who are joining us from across the globe. You are welcome in this place for the Experts Dialogue series. And on today's topic, we are hoping to touch on a couple of questions. We're really interested to hear from Dr. Iman, what does the situation really look like for people who are on the move? But at the same time, want to understand that there is an issue of trapped populations and immobile populations. So what does it look like for those who are forced or who would like to have the option to stay? What about those who are left behind? We are also very keen to talk a bit more about accountability from the global development system and whether we're looking at the Global Compact on Migration ambitions or looking at regional regional integration mechanisms within the African continent, particularly the Horn of Africa, where Sudan is based, and even much more largely on the continent. We're also going to have the opportunity to unpack a bit and ask this role of the African Union. Indeed, what is the role of the African Union in helping people to move and take refuge in other African countries? We also want to put a spotlight on the international community and make a bit of a comparison from recent crisis and also protracted crisis and the kind of responses that have been seen in these crises, and to understand and probably also to inspire practitioners and policymakers in taking bold steps and sometimes not repeating bad experiences, as one may put them. But more importantly, we would like that you're able to also engage with Dr. Iman, who's here to join us. We will kick you off. Iman, thank you again for finding time. I know it's super early in the morning in Canada. We can see by the number of people joining in. It's just about 17 past 9 in the morning in the Americas, and we're well into the afternoon here. What is the situation for people on the move in Sudan?
Thank you very much, Paddy, and I'm pleased to be back. And as you mentioned, this time also wearing the hat of a GRFDD fellow. That's a pleasure and an honor for sure, and I hope to contribute as I continue to engage with GRFDD. The situation in Sudan is really unfortunate. It's disastrous, and on the 15th of April, military clashes started in the capital of Khartoum, and somehow the people of Sudan have been sort of anticipating this crisis to happen, because over the last few years there have been a lot of military mobilization, and people would just give you some eyewitness accounts that, oh, we saw lots of military vehicles, we saw troops, and they could not interpret, but the sense of insecurity had been building on and on for quite some time. And to give some background also, in 2021, we witnessed, in October, we witnessed a military coup that overthrew a hybrid government between military and civilian. The civilian side of the government was somehow appealing to the aspirations of the people of Sudan, who had carried out a revolution and peaceful protests over the years 2019 and onwards, until the regime of 30-year military rule by President Omar Bashir was overthrown. And it was a very fragile, I would say, arrangement that ended up with a military coup. And then people started seeing the same pattern of abductions, arrests, and harassment of community activists, political activists, even trade unionists, including the doctors' trade union in Sudan. So this is just some background. Mid-April, the clashes started with the pattern. Basically, it was the Sudan military forces against a faction, which is a militia faction that had been integrated into the military. So it's basically the military split up into two, and And fighting started where civilians started to be caught in crossfire. It expanded to Darfur, which is another fragile part of the country over the years. I think, interestingly, when people started to know Darfur, and those who were unfamiliar with Sudan, sometimes you ask, so where is Sudan? And the response would be from those who didn't know, Sudan is in Darfur, because Darfur was all over the media. And the reality is Darfur is in Western Sudan. It has had seen atrocities of war over the years. And the militia that split up from the military has a record of human rights violations in that part of Sudan, and the military itself also has a record. And the top generals now leading the two factions, each one of them has a record of human rights violations, accusations of orchestrating genocide. The militia is previously known as the Janjaweed, and up until now, Janjaweed translates into devils on horsebacks. So I just wanted to give some background, because someone who doesn't know would be surprised maybe of, oh, what's happened? This country was just sort of all right, but it wasn't, it was never all right, because all of the arrangements made were very fragile, and it was like a ticking bomb. Clashes started, and it can be described as a city war in the capital of Khartoum, and that basically you could say civilians have been caught in the crossfire of the two fighting factions. It is fierce. There is aerial bombardment and ground war in the neighborhoods, among homes. People's houses are raided. There's massive looting. So quite scary for the population, burning of properties. And it's what I describe as a scorched earth policy, where there is massive destruction of property, both government and private property. Massive looting and widespread destruction. The population was literally and continues to be caught in the crossfire. And that means people were not even able to leave the fighting zones. The war started breaking out and then spreading like fire across the capital, Khartoum. And more of the testimonies, even our own families, friends, people we know, were not able to leave the spaces that were witnessing active fighting. And you hear of people who said, okay, I was trapped in my apartment or in my house for a week, for 3 days, and so on, before they were able to make small movements outside this zone, and then war catches up into the other zone and so on. So there was massive population movement within the capital of Khartoum. You see, when as if it's like a burning city, and people were swarming, trying to get out of that, out of the danger. Again, witness testimonies also would tell you, oh, my building witnessed raiding by some of the fighting forces, or there was a mortar shell that fell in the building next door, or even in my home or in my front yard. And then again, cannons shooting into houses, and people dying, like family members being lost as a result of all of this random shooting, bullets and shelling. It was ground and area. You can imagine that. Now, this was also coupled with life coming to a standstill. People were not able to go out to fetch water. Electricity was cut off from many parts of the city, and healthcare became in dire situation. People were not able, those injured could not reach health facilities. And the situation escalated very fast and heavily. When people found the chance to get out of the war zones, and as I said, it was like a graded movement outside the center, moving on to other neighborhoods, moving on to the outskirts of Khartoum. Those who were able to make it exited to neighboring cities, to rural areas, and so on. That continued to be the pattern. As the conflict continued, some people were able to move towards the borders of Sudan, seeking exit and safe haven in neighboring countries. And people moved in all directions, honestly. Some went northwards to Egypt. Some went towards the Red Sea, the city of Port Sudan, and along the way, El-Gadarif, Kassala, and so on. Some people went southwards towards South Sudan, and the people of Darfur, the natural path goes towards Chad, Ethiopia, Eritrea. So what I wanted to highlight is that Sudan is it's a huge country, and we have 7 neighboring countries. So you can imagine we have Egypt, Libya, Chad, Central African Republic, South Sudan, Ethiopia, and Eritrea. And it was just like you threw all of these bombs, and then people scattered around seeking refuge. Thank you.
Iman, thank you for this and just giving us, in terms of shaping the background and understanding, it seems as though there's actually been people that could have probably been displaced several times since the military coup, and then also talking about the events that happened since the 15th of April, the issue in terms of trapped mobilities and access and limitations to basic services, and then also, the difficult decision to flee. So, you've mentioned about the different neighbors that are there. We're just wondering what are really the options for people to stay? And maybe you could talk to us a little bit about what you see as the role of regional organizations such as the Intergovernmental Authority on Development. We understand the protocol on free movement, and there's some roadmaps, and things continue to move. Do some of what we see as these frameworks, when they're signed up in the various capitals or in the different spaces, was this made available to Sudanese people as they were trying to cross borders? And also talk to us about the options to stay and who is left behind.
Thank you very much, Paddy. So people took these journeys of hardship, I call them, towards the neighboring countries. And by the time they reached the borders, they were exhausted, drained of, people were literally dehydrated, having no stocks of medical supplies, their own treatment. Diabetic patients reached the border with Egypt. The climate is very hot there. And I learned of a diabetic elderly lady whose insulin dose just expired because of the heat by the time she reached there, and then she suffered the complications and passed away. So these are the kinds of hardships facing the people now. Reaching the borders, many people were trapped at the border. There was stagnation. People were not let in immediately. I'd like to highlight an agreement between the Sudan and Egypt, and it's known as the 4 Freedoms Agreement. That was signed in 2004, and the content of that included these 4 freedoms of movement, the right to take residence, work as well, and owning property. And this agreement is not being enacted. It's partially enacted, and it gave rights to Egyptian nationals to reside, work, and own property in Sudan. But ironically, when it came to implementing it from the Egyptian side towards Sudanese nationals, number one, it wasn't implemented right away. Number two, there were exclusions, and Egypt excluded men of productive age. They were not granted visas automatically, as it's the case for men above 65 and girls and women. So from the beginning, it came out faulty, and it was a one-sided benefit from this agreement. And now, in such dire situation, people were trapped and continue to be, by the way, trapped at the border with Egypt. And the border area itself is like desert with no services, not even shelter to shelter oneself from the extreme heat. No water provision, no toilets, no medical care. Only after more than a week of stagnation and us Sudanese in diaspora and inside the country were making contacts and publicity about this, then the international community response came later on by sending assessment missions. And then our volunteer doctors from the UK actually set up a clinic. We realized that the problem is on the Sudan side, because even the response that came late was set up on the Egyptian side, while people were stagnating behind. So that's just, I see it as a continuation of the entrapment. And that's concerning Egypt. Now, looking at the rest of Sudan and the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, which is an African Union body, basically. IGAD includes 8 countries, as we may know: Sudan, South Sudan, Ethiopia, Eritrea, Somalia, Djibouti, Kenya, and Uganda. And in under the IGAD, there is the Protocol on Free Movement of Persons, which was signed in the year 2020. Interestingly enough, in the capital of Khartoum, it was signed. And the protocol was coupled with a roadmap for implementation, and that roadmap includes putting in place policies and regulations and laws to ensure the right of entry and abolishment of visa. Yet still that has not really been enacted or put in place. And one would expect that in a situation like this, immediately the IGAD would step up in order to enable Sudanese to cross the borders and waiving the visa regulations. That has not been the case. People were crossing the borders to Ethiopia, and at a point in time, that road was sort of a block was put on that route. Those who went southwards towards South Sudan saw hardships along the road. People of Darfur exited to Chad, and that route has been sort of tried before, because populations and generations of refugees have been crossing to Chad. Yet the situation across the border is really dire, the humanitarian situation. So these are examples of those kinds of agreements that are not enacted. I would mention that my own family member, in seeking refuge, we were scrambling across websites to try and get him a visa to any neighboring countries. And after the conflict had started, Ethiopian visa online was stopped. You just get an error message on the website. Ugandan visa, you have to apply and provide all the documentation and so on. So no special measures were taken to enable people to cross safely and in safety and dignity to these neighboring countries, which are IGAD members, which are part of this agreement. And that agreement is not new. There have been some arrangements in the past for free movement of populations, and somehow Sudan fell off the wagon. And if you go to Kenya, for example, there is at the airport, there is a lane for East African nationals, and Sudanese are not part of that. So it's really, it's just a dire situation. Thank you.
I mean, dire situation in a lot of ways that, you know, these are people essentially feeling very trapped. You can't go back to where you have come from. You can neither cross the border, relying on family contacts and diaspora contacts that are able to provide that nature of information. How can you explain to us a bit of what you think about those who are left behind, the elderly, people living with disabilities, people with chronic diseases? You've just given us a tragic story of, someone losing their life. So the fear that goes around, but what is the profile like of people who are left behind, and what are they left behind with? Who provides for them in the meantime?
Thank you very much, Paddy. It's interesting that from the stories of people, and in general, in situations of mass exodus, those who are left behind are usually those who cannot make it outside the war zone. And this is typically the elderly, as you mentioned, and those with chronic illnesses. We have an elderly population, some have suffering from Alzheimer's disease, some debilitating illnesses. And our society is very much connected and intertwined, that because there isn't a proper system for caring for the elderly like in Western countries. The setup is that we care for our own elders. And what happened under this war is that people chose to stay behind with their elders who could not leave, with the sick members of the families, with those who have physical disabilities. I know many friends of mine who are dual nationals and could have been evacuated as a foreign national, but they were put in that grind between a mortar and a pestle to make a decision of whether to leave their elders alone, trapped in a war zone, and exit to safety, or stay behind with their elders. And the decision has mostly been staying behind. I know some who could also exit as foreign nationals, yet they chose to take the journey from Khartoum through the Wadi Saidna, the military base, which foreign countries chose to or found temporary safety to evacuate their citizens. Instead of going that route, because they could not take along their elders who didn't have that privilege of being a foreign national or national of a second country. Because of that, they took the journeys of hardship all the way to the borders in order to seek safe haven with their elders, with their debilitated family members. So that's part of the tragedy, but let alone those who have dual nationality. It's just, let's think of an ordinary citizen of Sudan who has the right to safety, the right to life, and these rights have been flagrantly violated. And they had no safe haven to go to. What about those who didn't have any extended family in the rural areas or in second cities? That is the majority, unfortunately. And then our own families, there is those who can't afford the journey because the prices of those bus tickets all the way to Port Sudan or to Wadi Halfa in the north or all the way through to South Sudan, the prices skyrocketed, and not everyone can afford that. The price of a bus ticket from Khartoum to Port Sudan started with $400 and then started climbing up. Same Egyptwards, and I must say that the Khartoum airport was bombarded on the first days of the conflict. So that brought the country to a complete state of paralysis and the citizens to entrapment. Thank you.
I'm going to skip to a question about the diaspora because we're talking about, those who would have access to an extended family member in the diaspora. And we will open the floor in a moment, and I'm glad that already hands are coming up. Just talk to us before we open the floor in terms about what you see as the role of diaspora, and particularly talking about Sudanese doctors and organizations in terms of how they support people with information, with provision, but also a bit about the innovation that you see in terms of use of social media and so on.
Yeah, a lot of work has been going on. For example, those people who have gone missing, our young generations are rallying up on social media and creating campaigns, the lost and found humans. And After a few days, you would hear that, oh, this person has been found, and then a story accompanying that. So this is one of the ways our diaspora are rallying to support. As mentioned, I am part of the Sudan Doctors Union in Canada, and we have an alliance of 6 organizations of the doctors in diaspora. And from day one, we have been supporting our colleagues in the Sudan Doctors Trade Union inside Sudan by providing medical consultations online, by providing technical support in the humanitarian response itself, and also sponsoring the operation and relaunch and reopening of some health facilities. One of the obstacles I wish to mention, Paddy, is that the banking system has collapsed, and this is continues to make it very difficult for us to contribute towards the home country. And this is where we need some support from the international community to create some innovative solutions by providing some independent, supervised, and monitored mechanisms to channel our support. And I see that as the need for both in cash and in kind pools for all of this money, that people are standing ready and eager to support the country back home, but banking system has collapsed. There are lots of examples. People, Sudanese diaspora, are leading fundraisers. They are leading also peaceful protests and raising awareness about the war in Sudan and the quest for peace and the situation, the humanitarian situation. We are also linking up with our governments, proposing solutions and negotiating, opening pathways for Sudanese to seek refuge in those the array of countries that we exist in. Thank you.
Iman, thank you for this. I think you've shed light on quite a number of issues, and I think it's a good time for us to open the floor. And we will come back with a couple of questions also after that. So in terms of how we intend to floor, it is a conversation. So please do feel free to just raise your hand. And thank you to those who have joined us when we started with the conversation. I wasn't looking into the participants' side of the room. Now I see that it's filling up, and this is great. So please feel free. It is the space in which we are engaging with experts. It's the Experts Dialogue series. So it's a conversation that you have with experts, and please do feel free. Amer Hermat, the floor is yours. Amer, the floor is yours. You can just unmute and we will be able to hear you. Hello, Dr. Sar. I think we were okay. Now I think it should be working. Amer,
Yes,
the floor is yours.
it's working. We can hear you.
Okay, go ahead, please. Let's feel free to just come in and ask questions. And in the meantime, as we are thinking about, yes, please go ahead.
I have a question to Dr. Iman.
Please go ahead.
In fact, if we see the international migration since last 5 to 6 years, most countries, they have been facing this conflict situation, whether it is a war internationally happening or within country, between countries. So we have to learn a lesson how to manage the migration involving other countries. So what kind of thing we can learn from Sudanese experience? Can you give few things, and especially focusing on kids and gender? What kind of lesson we should learn and apply in migration governance?
If I copied your question correctly, Professor Saho, it's I think it's important for me to mention the the crucial need to protect the right to asylum. And this is a global quest for us all working in the field of migration and refugee studies. And this is something that would protect those who are seeking refuge. And in terms of migration governance, we need to visit those regional mechanisms and agreements and to really enact them. For example, the IGAD convention and that I just mentioned, I would hope that this process is sped up in order to accommodate the current situation of Sudanese. And what we saw from IGAD was an African Union statement early on, when on the 15th of April, very concise statement, standing with the people of Sudan, urging the parties to resolve their problems through dialogue. And then recently there were, last week, negotiations in Saudi Arabia, and again another brief statement commending the negotiations, asking the two parties to respect international law, and affirming the rights of the people of Sudan to exit to safety and so on. So these brief statements are good, but they are not practical. And what we are seeking is practical solutions. A third thing I would like to note the importance of is for the international community to harness the powers of the diaspora. Not only doctors' organizations, we have huge communities around the world who are ready to propose solutions to contribute to this. And we are in touch with our people inside Sudan. So the knowledge of the diaspora communities about the situation and the ability to propose solutions should not be undermined, should be really, I think, highlighted and really harnessed upon. And we need to capitalize on this strength, because I do believe that these are mechanisms that can contribute positively and disperse the responsibility, because the diaspora communities are ready to contribute. So why not allow these communities, enable them to shoulder part of the responsibilities? And we have a good example to learn from, which is the case of Ukraine, when countries of the European Union and North America stepped up to receive Ukrainians by creating pathways and programs. And the Ukrainian diaspora was part and parcel of bringing up and materializing these solutions. I hope I have addressed your question, Dr. Saho. Thank you.
Dr. Saho, you are more than welcome.
Thank you. I got
Thank you so much. I mean, I think, Iman, what you have also shared in terms of, I wanted to kind of maybe just come back again on harnessing of the potential of the diaspora. Often in this space, whether we're in a GRFDT classroom where we are, talking about, particular, how governments want to engage, or how governments and international community perceive diaspora engagement, there is always some missing gaps. And the issue of trust has always raised up. In fact, I think from a co-organized global diaspora virtual exchange in 2021, we have kind of brought together different speakers to talk about building trust. And it almost felt as though you were really at the beginning of a relationship, and started talking about kind of human elements related things, but also structure related issues. To what extent do you see the power of building trust, and how important that is in terms of diaspora engagement between governments and listening in to the Sudanese diaspora right now, as you are essentially knocking on the door to want to be able to provide that help and support?
Thank you very much, Paddy. I think there is a good room for that. We have been active citizens in our communities, in the second homes, and contributing, paying our taxes, being active in, for us, for example, in the Canadian Life. Some of us are university professors, also contributing to Life. We are part of the general Canadian workforce. Even our newcomers are engaging and contributing to Life. And we do have some dialogue, as I mentioned. I actually would like to invite my colleague Aladdin because they have a very good example from Australia. And I think that's it just demonstrates the power of the diasporas. Australia has been in contact with the diaspora communities. The community has been active and there were certain positive outcomes. So I don't know, Aladdin, if you are around and if you could enlighten us a little about your experience and the commitments made by the government, the presentations you made to the government. Aladdin, over to you.
I think as Aladdin is trying to come on and unmute, I see Dr. Raj has a hand up and will be great to hear. Aladdin, just feel free to raise your hand so that we can identify in the group and unmute your mic. Dr. Raj, did you want to come in with a question as we take a pause to hear more on the example from Australia? Dr. Raj, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me. Thank you, Dr. Iman, for giving us this background and the current situation on Sudan. My question or observation is that in a situation of conflict or crisis, because this is conflict and crisis, because conflict leads to crisis in the sense of not being able to manage. So you are in a panic mode, crisis mode. Do we have any toolbox from which to draw on how to manage humanitarian situations, migration, people who are trapped, people who are left behind, disabled, those who can't make it, those who don't have resources, in the interest of saving lives? Do we have, not I mean GRFDT, is there any toolbox which can guide us to follow? The case of Ukraine was different in the sense that it was firstly an external conflict. That means there were another country involved. This is internal, okay? Internal factions, political disagreements, power situation, and so on. So people have to move because this is a situation of insecurity now, in all respects, not only life insecurity, food insecurity, shelter insecurity, all sorts of, which makes people react to this situation by fleeing, running. Where can I find a safety? What do we have? These crises are not new. What can we learn from previous crises? What is there for us to say going forward, anticipating there will be environmental related crises? People have to move. They have to go somewhere in terms of looking for safety. Are we preparing ourselves? Do we have any kind of experiences or experiments whereby we can see how to manage before the situation escalates and lives are lost and development has gone maybe 20, 30 years behind and back to poverty and back to people moving internally or externally and so on? This is something I think it's interesting to reflect on. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Raj. I wouldn't call it a toolbox, but there are mechanisms, coordination mechanisms set in place and have been working for the past minimum 2 decades, which is the United Nations and humanitarian partners coordination mechanisms. I've had the chance to be part of the working in the humanitarian field, and there are interesting coordination methods of, that go by sector or cluster. It's called the cluster approach, the humanitarian cluster approach, where all health partners come together and define the goals. Funds are raised for the entire humanitarian setup, and that includes health, water, sanitation and hygiene, food, security, nutrition, and agriculture, and so on. So each of the United Nations specialized agencies is either leading one of those clusters or co-leading it with an international NGO. And that involves local organizations as well, local NGOs, international NGOs, local even CBOs and community groups. And mechanisms have been put in place to also build the capacity of the local partners to step up, to improve their financial reporting systems and so on, in order to be able to receive funds and report back on these. Now, all of this is a humanitarian setup, and you mentioned something very important, which is the climate aspect. Climate change is here to stay and only to escalate. And I don't think that we have put in place some good mechanisms to deal with that. Again, there is only the starting mechanism, same as this IGAD agreement in the East African bloc and across the continent of Africa, because Africa is now seeing droughts, floods, and population movement as a result of climate change. Most of it is not really highlighted as problematic as it is. And a very important thing I would like to mention also in relation to this population movement as a result of climate change is the composition of those militias operating across the belt of Africa, sub-Saharan Africa and Sahel, all the way to East Africa. Believe it or not, many of those recruits of the Rapid Support Forces that is now fighting in Sudan are young African men. Some of them are underage, and they have been recruited from across the continent. And that element of droughts, lack of proper jobs, lack of education, population movement, and dire living situations and poverty, of course, across the continent is contributing to these young people joining such militias, because the militia leaderships pay a bit of money to the families, they pay a bit of money to these young people, they arm them, and then they send them to fight even in Asia, in Yemen. We have strong evidence, and it's like all over the media, that the Rapid Support Forces were fighting on behalf of certain countries in the Yemen war. So these are examples of what climate change is causing. And as I told you, I don't think there is not even a regional or a continental mechanism that absorbs all of these realities and turns them into action in order to deal with all of the complications of population movement. Is a result of an underlying problem. As you mentioned, climate change, there is conflict, there is famine, and so on. So we have ways of responding, but mitigating the impact of climate change, I think we're still far behind. And not only climate change. The continent is ridden with conflicts, yet still we don't have that mechanism to enact, adapt immediately as conflict happens. Our doctors' union back in Sudan is in close coordination now with the humanitarian agencies, and there are lots of questions coming up on how to provide this or that. So the contextual specificity also plays a role. But I believe that what you suggest as a toolbox needs to be, we need to drill down and really develop some, there are frameworks such as the, like the Humanitarian Development Peace Nexus and so on. But in reality, and as a humanitarian aid worker, I think many of these mechanisms are still more abstract, more conceptual, and they need to be brought down to reality and tested out. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Iman, for that. I think, you know, one of the things that you've actually raised, I mean, a couple of very important points that you've raised in response to Dr. Raj, but I think it also responds in a lot of ways in terms of best practice. I mean, I think that we are not short of research that's been done on how different actors support or contribute to government responses in terms of a crisis. But in this particular case, there is also a governance crisis. And so the role of the diaspora and the role of all other actors is seen as very important. But I think at the same time, that also means that sometimes lawlessness, as you've kind of put it, but also things we don't expect to be happening in a normal situation would happen. And the problem is that we don't have accountability systems that actually work at the regional level, at the continental level, and neither do they work at the national level. I was also just thinking, as you were sort of sharing into different mechanisms, very specific to the diaspora in terms of diaspora's responses in humanitarian space. Now, I'll give you an example of diaspora from the African continent that has been present here in the Balkans and in Europe, and coming together and trying to support third country nationals that were fleeing Ukraine because they were the invisible spot. And even, some outfits out there that say, yes, we work with diaspora, very specific on humanitarian action. When we approach them, they didn't have that kind of a mechanism. They are also still relying on international community that will open its purse to provide the kind of funding. And at the end of the day, what ends up happening is that diasporas then don't look for a mechanism. They just take the action in the absence of a mechanism. Now, I think in the case of protracted crisis, of course, you've got all manner of frameworks out there. And I actually have a personal argument to say that diasporans don't have to become humanitarian actors, in the same way that I think we need to be careful in how we put them as development actors. Some are independent development actors. Some want to be with government and work in a wider development cooperation ecosystem as development actors. But that's also the diversity that is out there and how we leverage that. So I think in as much as we have so many tools, by the way, I think we also have a tool, a recent publication under iDiaspora that we have cooperated with here at GRFDT that tries to look at diaspora engagement in humanitarian crisis. I think it's rather a complex one. And often, as one who has been engaged in helping people, you just get lost. You knock on all sorts of doors. You write to the first ladies of the African Union, whatever. You write to people in the United Nations at headquarters. And somehow these systems don't seem to work when we're in crisis. So I wanted to end with a question that comes to you. But before that, I saw Ahmed. Ahmed, did you want to share with us? Mutala Hassan, did you want to ask a question or share reflection? Please go ahead. The floor is yours. And iPhone, I will ask you to identify yourself. Sorry, Ahmed, we cannot hear you. You need to unmute yourself. Just unmute yourself. And yes,
okay,
go
I
ahead.
just did that. Okay, thank you. That was a wonderful presentation. I really gained a lot of insight on what is happening in Sudan and the situation of Sudanese seeking for refuge in the neighboring country. I understand from the discussion of the presenter that the online visa platform of Ethiopia is not going. So Sudanese are finding it difficult to apply for visa online and go to the nearby countries. But like the situation of Nigeria, the online visa of Nigeria is still open, and African nationals can apply online. They only need the passport data page and the ticket to apply and come to Nigeria, and they will have 30-day visitors pass. So I think if they can leverage on this opportunity when they arrive here, they can, take advantage of the Sudanese diaspora in Nigeria, because I'm looking at the consular service. They also come with some challenges since it's an internal crisis. Some may not be warmly welcome in the consular, the embassy of Sudan in Nigeria. So they may be identified with the Sudanese diaspora in Nigeria, and they can get some help. And I'm sure they can also liaise with the United Nations High Commissioner Office of Refugees and to get some support. And I know that the National Commission for Refugees, Migrants, and Internally Displaced Persons in Nigeria is doing a lot of work in the area of refugees. It's giving a lot of support. Like recently, the Cameroonian, Amazonian crisis in Cameroon, a lot of Cameroonian refugees have received support from this government agency. I think about 24,000 of them at the moment have been given healthcare support. They have been enrolled into the National Healthcare Scheme. About 24,000 refugees, based on the recent report on the Global Compact for Refugee Implementation in Nigeria that was launched last year, December. So I think there are a lot of opportunities in Nigeria to provide support for Sudanese fleeing the crisis of Sudan. And that is it. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Ahmed, thank you. Thank you for that opportunity. It's very nice to hear some very practical advice coming from a space like this. I wish that governments would raise their hands and be as vibrant as you were in terms of sharing what those pathways look like, even when people have to seek safety outside of their home countries, as the topic is today. iPhone, I see somebody with a hand called iPhone. Do you mind to just identify yourself by name? Okay. Iman, we will have to close quite shortly because in the interest of time. So we're gonna bring it. I mean, I know we've talked a lot about international community and what we can see. Emeka, would you like to share? Please go ahead and share. Just unmute yourself. And you have about a minute.
Okay, I
Thank
can
you.
now. Can you hear me?
Super. Hi, Emeka. How are you? You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Paddy. Thank you. It's a wonderful sharing, which I think is also insightful. My question, I've been looking for the platform to ask this question. I missed out that in our gathering in Ethiopia last month, or 2 weeks ago. My question is the international framework of migrants in countries in crisis. How much was that, or is that being used in Sudan? This is Sudanese crisis right now. I had reports about how Nigeria is helping and how opportunity will be for Sudanese, but the reality which many African countries, particularly Nigeria, which I speak to, experience is in this time of crisis in Sudan, it was difficult for the Nigerians to get evacuated through Ethiopia, which is closer to Sudan. We have to go through Egypt to do that, and then necessarily have to stay in the desert to do that. But the whole idea of MIKIK, which was started at the Libya crisis and has been institutionalized with IOM as a secretariat, and have done so much in praising how much it helps in times of crisis. The whole idea is that at moments like this, irrespective of your migratory status or your nationality, the international community brings facility of transportation to evacuate people as quick as possible to the safest situation, and then do the processing of where you come from and where you are going. But my question is, for those who are on the ground in Sudan, was this used or what happened? Thank you.
Thank you very much to the last speakers. Let me come back on these two elements. With regards to Ethiopia, it's a neighboring country with very good ties to Sudan. The reality is not only did Visa Online get suspended or this error thing, but also the consular office in Al Gadarif city, which is closer to Ethiopia, was closed after the conflict. So these are examples. And a little thing I wish to highlight, electricity, communication, networks, and so on had been cut off inside Sudan. So it's a luxury to be able to go online. And the one example I gave of my family member is what we were doing from the outside as their extended network of support. So think of how many people inside Sudan don't have that leverage. They don't have that capacity to have someone from abroad helping them with online visa. Those who just want to take that route, maybe by foot, yet be able to enter a second country in safety. And that is the real, display of how people were trapped and continue to be trapped inside Sudan, and just hoping that a mortar shell wouldn't fall on their heads sooner or later. So it's a round-the-clock feeling of insecurity. With regards to what you asked, your question, the answer is no. No international mechanisms have been used to move people to safety. I can tell you that dead bodies are scattered around the streets of Khartoum. People can't even bury their dead in dignity. And there is the medico-legal aspect of this matter, because when people die in the context of war, there are certain legal steps to be taken of documentation before burial. We haven't seen any support in this arena, and that is an environmental health situation crisis in the making, in and by itself. And I will give an example of the World Food Programme, who unfortunately faced attacks in Darfur, and 3 of the staff of WFP passed away as were killed in this conflict, and the organization that provides food assistance had to exit or chose to exit Sudan or suspend its operations inside Sudan at a time when the people are starving in these war zones. So the minimum support of food assistance that could go a long way has not materialized, or we haven't heard of that. Medical supplies in order to enter the country are facing a lot of red tape because of the suspension of air transport. Medical kits sitting at the seaport of Port Sudan city continue to sit there for weeks upon end because the government is not giving permission to offload and safe passage. And a big theme in this war is the lack of humanitarian corridors. And I can tell you, people have been doing it on their own, from their pockets, with very limited international support. We are ready, and our people are working hand in hand with the international community, whom I believe could step up its operations inside Sudan. Even though international staff has been evacuated or taken to safe haven, within the country, there is a lot that could be done. And I do commend all of the efforts that have been taken, but no evacuation to safe haven, no organized evacuation to these people trapped within the capital Khartoum or Sudan, like this organized movement of buses and so on. Another thing I wish to mention in relation to this is visa fees is also another obstacle, and you would expect it to be waived at a point in time like this. And these are the measures that I would hope to see: waiving visa fees, speeding up these agreements and so on, and mechanisms that would enable Sudanese to reach safe haven with the least costly, most dignified, through the least costly, most dignified ways. Thank you.
Iman, thank you so much for shedding light on quite a number of issues, giving us a sense of what the historic background is to this crisis, but particularly zooming us into what the vulnerabilities that people who opt to leave, forced to leave, those who cannot make those journeys because of different inabilities, but also particularly in relation to the issue around legal pathways, but also in talking about what the responses have looked like, both from the different parties that are there, the closed doors. I think that's also been something that you have raised in terms of how do we open those doors, whether we're talking about easing visa regulations, we're talking about activating very strongly regional frameworks. And so I'm hoping that as we will continue with this conversation, and I'm happy to say that in the next set of conversations around this particular theme, so we're planning to have at least 2 more that look at Sudan, people on the move, that it will actually be Iman in the driving seat and having conversations with various parties, and us getting a little bit more in depth into what this particular topic is about. So Iman, thank you very much for being able to share today with us from your space of knowledge and from your extensive experience. To close us today, in terms of also speaking a bit about how we're going to move forward in about a few minutes or so, I will ask Professor Binod, who is the president of GRFDT, to share some closing remarks. Iman, again, thank you very much. Professor Binod, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Paddy. I hope I can hear me. Yes, Iman, it has been a very, very educative session. At the same time, being the first one in the series, I think this has set the tone of the discussion. And you have actually, encouraged all of us to take part actively and raise different kinds of questions and points. That's where I'm reminded of Paddy's point that we, cannot expect the diaspora to step in as, making the difference, but only as a catalyst, so to say. That I think is important. And I think what is important is that the question of toolbox, we need to, as researchers, as, advisors to the government or the other stakeholders, it is important that we bring in the question of time horizon. what are the immediate needs and what are the other needs that need to be planned over a different point of time. That scale is important to be mentioned, whereby so that we are not, confused in terms of or not driven by the crisis into another crisis situation. This is where I think the points that have been raised by different speakers here today are actually important in terms of learning lessons and drawing the attention of other governments, other countries. And I'm thinking of what India had done in dealing with another crisis, the COVID crisis. The question of evacuation was dealt with by India in a very, very efficient way. And that's where, why not India step in? Vande Bharat, the flights that were, brought in to evacuate people, that, the international call can come in for the food security, food supply, large scale food supply was being done by the diaspora in the United States in terms of supplying food packets to India. That was very, very important. And as you mentioned, Iman, yourself, the disposal of the dead bodies, that also was a huge, mission in the case of India. So this is, I think, a point where we need to draw upon the immediate lessons from the earlier crisis that we had. Well, of course, Ukraine is another crisis, but as Raj had mentioned, that was an external aggression, and here the crisis is from the internal coup. But the solution, how to respond this for the purpose of, so that this does not get elongated over a longer period of time and does not get repeated in other countries. Those are the points that we perhaps have been able to draw our attention to by today's discussion. And I think perhaps this is a sign that we'll have more of these in this series and other issues that can be taken up. Over to you, Patty.
Thank you. If I may, Paddy, I just want to mention and commend the efforts of all of these countries that have given Sudanese leave to stay. There is an example of Saudi Arabia who gave a 3 months extension for those trapped in the country. Many people went for the Umrah religious rituals. In Canada, there were measures taken to give those who are in country on limited arrangements also. And I am sure that many countries of the world, not only to mention the negative sides, there are good examples that have happened around the world, and we commend that, we acknowledge, and we wish to build on that. Between Sudan and Ukraine, if I'm also allowed to mention, the similarity is people trapped in the crossfire, yet we saw the organized buses taking Ukrainians to safe haven in neighboring countries, the trains and so on. And this is lacking, unfortunately, in the case of Sudan, because the government itself is party to the conflict. Thank you, and back to you, Paddy.
Thank you so much, Iman, for sharing today. Professor Binod, thank you for giving us that last word of encouragement, even as we will continue. We will be sharing the dates for the next Expert Dialogue series, another conversation in which we're still focusing on Sudan, particularly for this month and for a couple of weeks to go, and announcing each series as we successively go forward. But we'll look forward to you joining us. We'll probably try to keep them on the Tuesdays. It's a special day for JRFDT, as our conversations on Tuesdays and Thursdays have been in the past. And so we will be giving you the calendar in the different fora. Thank you so much for being here today, and have a good evening, good afternoon, and good morning.
Thank you, Paddy, and thanks to your audiences and for the opportunity. Thanks to JRFDT as well.
Thank you, Iman. Thank you for being here today.
The very stimulating initial series. Can you hear me? Excuse me. Thank you. Very well done, Iman. I think we started the series very well. So
thank you. My pleasure.
thank you to all. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.